Hello, I'm continuing my reviews on the Psycho series with Psycho 3. Now, Psycho 3 came out in 1986, and this is actually directed by Anthony Perkins, who, of course, plays Norman Bates in the movie, and he played Norman Bates in the first two films. And the screenplay for this is actually written by Charles Edward Pogue, and he also wrote the screenplay for David Cronenberg's remake of The Fly. Now, if you've been watching my reviews recently, you would know me and my friend Eric recently reviewed the first two Psycho movies, and at the end of our review on Psycho 2, I said how it's been a long time since I've seen Psycho 3, but I remember it not being too good. Well, I recently rewatched the movie for this review, and to be honest, I actually think the film is better than I remember it being. However, I can't say it's a great movie either. I really don't know what my opinion on this film is. It's not a bad movie, but at the same time, it's nothing like mind-blowing or groundbreaking by any means. Now, Psycho 3 picks up where Psycho 2 left off. Now, one of the things that I appreciated so much about Psycho 2 was, in Psycho 2 you find out that Norman really wasn't the villain. Like, in Psycho 2, you saw Norman Bates really trying to put his life back together, and in the film you realize that there was somebody killing people, but at the end of the film you find out that it wasn't Norman Bates. Now, towards the end of the film, they make you think that it was the character of Lila Loomis, who was one of the main characters from the first one, who came back for Psycho 2, only she became kind of like a villain in Psycho 2, and you thought at the end, because she does get killed at a certain point towards the end, you thought maybe it was her who was killing all those people in Psycho 2, but then towards the very end of that movie, Norman is greeted by this woman who he worked at the diner he started working at in Psycho 2, named Mrs. Spool, and Mrs. Spool reveals to Norman that she was actually his real mother, and the film played on the whole idea that what if Norman Bates was actually adopted, and it turns out that Mrs. Spool was the one who was actually killing people throughout Psycho 2, but at the very end of that movie, because of all that Norman went through, he went crazy again and killed Mrs. Spool, and started using Mrs. Spool as kind of like the thing to represent his mother, and he developed the whole split personality thing again. So basically in this film, Norman is the villain again, but what happens in this film is Mrs. Spool, nobody knows what happened to her, and now there's this reporter who thinks that Norman Bates had something to do with it, and in the film, there's this young woman who's a former nun who lost her faith in God, and she actually tried killing herself, but when these nuns tried to save her, she accidentally killed one of them, so she gets kicked out of the church and eventually comes to the Bates Motel, and in the film, Norman and this woman develop kind of a relationship with each other, and in the film, Norman sees something in this young woman that reminds him of Marion Crane, who was the woman that Norman Bates killed in the first movie, so, Norman starts to fall in love with this woman, but of course, his alternate personality, the mother personality, doesn't like this, and that's the basic plotline of Psycho 3. Now, Psycho 3 I thought was a decent sequel, but not great by any means, but at the same time not bad either. I don't know, I'm so in between on this movie. There are some things I really liked about it. In the film, Jeff Fahey plays this sleazy musician who stops by the Bates Motel and gets a job there, and he's such a scumbag, yet his character, he's a scumbag, yet the way Jeff Fahey plays him, this character is actually really entertaining. So I really liked Jeff Fahey's character. Well, I shouldn't say I liked the character because he was a scumbag, but the way Jeff Fahey played him, I really liked the way he was played in the film. You know, I thought it was an interesting character, you know, so I liked that aspect. And in the film, there's this reporter who is the one who thinks Norman Bates had something to do with Mrs. Spool's disappearance, and, you know, she's probably my favorite character in the movie. Like, there's a really hilarious scene in the movie where Jeff Fahey's character meets her in a bar, and he's hitting on her, and he says that his nickname is Duke or something, and the woman's like, "Oh, I had a dog named Duke once. I hated the mutt." I thought that was absolutely hilarious, you know, so there are some things I really liked about it. Like, a few of the characters in the movie are really good. Some of the things I didn't really care for about the movie was, like, I feel like, this film, it comes off as much more of your typical 80s slasher film, while Psycho 2, I felt, was much more of a psychological character study on Norman Bates. This film, it's just like pretty much your typical slasher film. However, you do see some elements from Psycho 2 in this, because it does definitely go into Norman Bates' psyche in this movie. Once again, it just comes off as your typical slasher film, and I'm not 100% complaining about that, because I do like slasher films, but I don't know, I felt like Psycho 2 was a much more intelligent movie than this, and really this one just comes off as your standard horror sequel, to be honest. But once again, it's not a bad movie, although I will say there is one scene in this movie where, if you remember in the original Psycho where that private eye detective got killed and he was falling down the stairs like that, Anthony Perkins tries recreating that shot in this movie, but it just comes off as so freaking cheesy. It's like, really? But I don't know, it's not a great film, but not bad at the same time. Like, it's more of a time waster, to be honest. Like, if you find a copy of Psycho 3, I would recommend giving it a watch. It's nowhere near as good as the first one or Psycho 2, but it's decent at the very least.